CMIS 3224. Web Designing and E-Commerce. CSS Part 4. Grid Layout. The CSS Grid Layout module offers a grid-based layout system with rows and columns, making it easier to design web pages without having to use floats and positioning. Display Property. An HTML element becomes a grid container when its display property is set to grid or inline grid. All direct children of the grid container automatically become grid items. The Grid Template Columns property. The Grid Template Columns property defines the number of columns in your grid layout, and it can define the width of each column. The value is a space-separated list, where each value defines the width of the respective column. If you want your grid layout to contain 4 columns, specify the width of the 4 columns, or auto, if all columns should have the same width. The Grid Template Rows property. The Grid Template Rows property defines the height of each row. Grid columns. The vertical lines of grid items are called columns. Grid rows. The horizontal lines of grid items are called rows. Grid gaps. The spaces between each column row are called gaps. You can adjust a gap size by using one of the following properties: grid column gap, grid row gap, grid gap. Example: gap between the columns. Example: Gap between the rows. Example. The grid gap property is a shorthand property for the grid row gap and the grid column gap properties. Example. The grid gap property can also be used to set both the row gap and the column gap in one value. Grid lines. The lines between columns are called column lines. The lines between rows are called row lines. Refer to line numbers when placing a grid item in a grid container. Example. Place a grid item at column line 1 and let it end on column line 3. Example. Place a grid item at row line 1 and let it end on row line 3. The justify content property. The justify content property is used to align the whole grid inside the container. Justify content, space evenly. Justify content, space around. Justify content, space between. Justify content, center. Justify content, start. Justify content, end. The align content property. The align content property is used to vertically align the whole grid inside the container. Align content. Center. Align content. Space evenly. Align content. Space around. Align content. Space between. Align content. Start. Align content. End. CSS grid item. Child elements, items. A grid container contains grid items. By default, a container has one grid item for each column, in each row, but you can style the grid items so that they will span multiple columns and/or rows. The grid column property. The grid column property defines on which columns to place an item. You define where the item will start and where the item will end. To place an item, you can refer to line numbers or use the keyword span to define how many columns the item will span. Example. Make item 1 start on column 1 and end before column 5. Example. Make item 1 start on column 1 and span 3 columns. Example. Make item 2 start on column 2 and span 3 columns. The grid row property. The grid row property defines on which row to place an item. You define where the item will start and where the item will end. To place an item, you can refer to line numbers or use the keyword span to define how many rows the item will span. Example. Make item 1 start on row line 1 and end on row line 4. Example. Make item 1 start on row 1 and span 2 rows. The grid area property. The grid area property can be used as a shorthand property for the grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, and the grid column end properties. Example. Make item 8 start on row line 1 and column line 2, and end on row line 5 and column line 6. Example. Make item 8 start on row line 1 and column line 2, and end on row line 5 and column line 6. The order of the items. The grid layout allows us to position the items anywhere we like. The first item in the HTML code does not have to appear as the first item in the grid. See you in the next video.